Carnegie Hall in New York City, the home of the world's greatest musical events. Today's event is one in a series of New York Philharmonic Young People's Concerts under the musical direction of Leonard Bernstein. And now, here is Mr. Bernstein.
Hello again. It's been much too long, I think, since we've seen each other, and I've missed you. Today, we're going to talk about a part of music that's really exciting and really fun. Orchestration. Now, this big word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and we're going to try and clear up what it really means. Mainly, it means how a composer goes about arranging his music for an orchestra to play, whether the orchestra has 7 men in it, or 17, or 70, or 107, which is what we have here on this stage. Now, to start things off, we're going to play you a piece by Rimsky-Korsakov, the Russian composer, who is looked up to by most people as the real master of orchestration, the composer who wrote the most famous book about orchestration, and the one that so many other composers have imitated ever since. Now listen to this last part of the Capriccio Español by Rimsky-Korsakov, or the Spanish Caprice, and notice how brilliantly he makes the orchestra shine, and how many different kinds of sounds he gets in 5 minutes of music, one after another, and how clear the music is, and most of all, how exciting the orchestration makes his music sound. Now, everybody will admit that that's a pretty exciting piece of orchestration. Brilliant. Now, let's take a look at one page of the conductor's score of this piece. This whole page, full of notes, is only 4 bars of music, this music you just heard. And it tells us everything that every instrument is doing in the orchestra for the duration of those 4 bars. This top part is the winds, this is the piccolo, and the flutes, and the oboes, and the clarinets, and the bassoon. And then come the horns, and this line has the trumpets on it. Here are the trombones, here is the timpani, and all these lines here are percussion instruments like castanets and snare drum and so on. This is the harp, and these are the strings at the bottom. The violins, first violins, second violins, the violas, the cellos, and finally the double basses. And that takes care of everybody in the orchestra. Now, how did Rimsky-Korsakov arrive at this page? What did he go through to figure it out? Well, to begin with, the music that he had in his head was made up of 4 different ideas. First of all, he had a big tune that went, and then he had another little tune that goes along with it. Then he has a Spanish rhythm, which is in the accompaniment. Then he has another Spanish rhythm at the same time in the accompaniment. Now, 4 different ideas. Now he was faced with the job of writing all that down for these 100-odd people to play in such a way that all 4 ideas would mesh together, strong and clear and exciting. And so he distributed the 4 ideas to the orchestra this way. He gave the big tune to the trombones here. Then he gave the other tune to the violins down here. Pardon my terrible voice, I can't sing in tune. Then he gave the first of those 2 Spanish rhythms, divided between the woodwinds and the horns. You see that? And then he divided the other Spanish rhythm between the timpani and the trumpets. And then that takes care of all 4 ideas. And it sounds this way after he put it all together. Fine. Now that sounds just great, especially with the addition of those percussion instruments giving it the Spanish flavor. Now what he did actually was to take the bare notes in his head and sort of put clothes on them so that they could go out into the world. After all, notes can't wander around naked. They have to be dressed up in orchestration. But good orchestration means not only clothes that you put music into, the way you wear a dress or a suit to keep yourself warm. It's got to be the right orchestration for that particular piece of music, like wearing the right suit or the right dress. Bad orchestration would be something like putting on a sweater to go swimming. It's just ridiculous. It's just wrong. Now, just for fun, let's listen to those same 4 bars again, orchestrated badly, just to see how wrong they can sound. You see how terrible that is? You can't hear the tune, the rhythms are too loud, and it all sounds clumsy and thick and not at all Spanish. So remember, what good orchestration means is orchestration that's exactly right for that music, and it lets the music be heard in the clearest and most effective way. Now that's pretty hard to do, because just think what a composer has to know before he can orchestrate a piece he's written. First, he has to understand how to handle each instrument separately. He has to know what it can do and what it can't do, what its lowest note is and what its highest note is, what its good notes are and its not so good notes, and all the different kinds of sounds it can make. Then, on top of that, he has to understand how to handle all kinds of different instruments together, to blend them and balance them and mix them. He has to be careful that some instruments, which are bigger and louder, like the trombone, don't drown out the littler, softer instruments like the flute. You see, that's easy to drown out. Then he has to be careful that the percussion section doesn't drown out the strings, for example. See, that would be very easy to drown out. Then he has to be careful about mixing the instruments so that they don't get all muddied up together and all kinds of problems like that. But the biggest problem he has is to choose, the problem of choice. Imagine yourself sitting down to orchestrate a piece you've written, and there are 107 instruments sitting there waiting for you to decide who should play when and what. You know how hard it is sometimes to decide something like, what would I rather have for Christmas, a pair of skates or a bicycle or whatever it is? Sometimes it takes you days or weeks to make up your mind. Well, imagine how hard it is for a composer to make up his mind and choose not between two things, like a pair of skates and a bicycle, but among all those instruments, to say nothing of the hundreds and millions of possible combinations of those instruments. For instance, I'm sure you all know the famous flute solo at the beginning of Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun. Do you know it? It goes like this. Now that's perfectly beautiful. It's exactly right. But what made Debussy decide on the flute, just the flute, to play that piece, to begin that piece? Well, Debussy knew what he wanted, or more exactly, he knew what the music wanted, what the music demanded. And that meant the flute with that sweet, pale, airy sound. If he had picked, let's say, the trumpet to do the same tune, it would have sounded all different. It would have been too fat and too rich and not at all delicate and afternoonish, the way the flute is. Listen to the trumpet doing it. Not the same thing, is it? It's just the wrong piece of clothing. He's going swimming in a sweater. Or take the beginning of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. You know that peculiar sliding wail on the clarinet that opens the piece? Now, imagine that tune played on, for example, a viola. Pretty silly, isn't it? Although beautifully played. But the whole feeling of jazz has gone out the window. Or take a Bach-Brandenburg concerto, like this one for strings. Now, let's imagine that marvelous piece played by brass instead of the strings. Well, that's not so bad either. But it's sure not what Bach meant by his music. So you see, it's an important part of a composer's job to choose his instruments, and to choose them right, because it's those instruments that have to carry his music to your ears. And there are so many possibilities. Now, just to give you an idea, of how many possibilities there are, let's try an experiment together, and let's us try and orchestrate something ourselves, just you and me. We're going to make believe we're all a great big orchestra, all of us, capable of giving out any kind of sound we want. Now let's take two simple notes in harmony, these two notes. And I want everybody downstairs to sing the bottom note, and everybody upstairs to sing the upper note. Bum. Now, let's sing the word glue to these notes. It's as good as any other word. All right? Glue. Let's hear the downstairs people first. Glue. Fine. Now the upstairs people. Glue. Wonderful. Now let's hear it all together. Wonderful. You're beginning to sound like an orchestra already. Now, we're going to orchestrate these two notes in different ways by making different sounds to the same notes. For instance, let's try to sound like an organ by simply saying very softly, ooh, on the notes instead of glue. We say, downstairs people, ooh, and upstairs people, ooh. Let's hear that softly. Even more softly. Now that's exactly like an organ. Up here, if you were standing here, you would believe you were hearing an organ. Now let's try another sound. Let's try it to sound more like strings singing softly. And to do this, let's not say anything. Let's just hum, not have any words at all. So downstairs people, upstairs people, okay? Softly. Sounds exactly like strings. Really, you're wonderful. Perfect strings. Now, let's try and sound like loud strings. And a good way to do that would be to buzz instead of hum. Get up, bzzz, and upstairs, bzzz. See if you can do it. Marvelous. Exactly right. Now I'll tell you what we're going to do. Since you're so good, let's try a couple of more. Let's see if we can imitate woodwinds by going tick, 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 tick. Short and sharp, over and over. T-I-C-K, tick. Tick downstairs, tick upstairs, let's hear it. No, but you have to be with me, and you have to sing very short and sharp. Tick, 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 like that. Tick. Wonderful, that's exactly like woodwinds. And now, let's try just one last one. How about being brass? Big, loud brass. Let's say, ta-ga-da! And the downstairs, ta-ga-da! Let's go. You weren't together. That's wonderful. Well, we could go on like this for a week, imitating the different sounds. But the point is, just to show you that there are so many ways those simple little two notes can sound. They can have so many different colors. That's really the word. Musical colors, of course, but really like real colors. Like when we sang the ooh sound, like an organ, to me, I immediately saw the color blue. Ooh, it seemed kind of bluish to me. And when we did the humming, it seemed darker and warmer, like a sort of deep red. And when we did ta-ga-da, I always see fiery orange for this brass sound. I don't know if you see colors when you hear music, but lots of people do. I know I always do. So with all these millions of colors to choose from, a composer really has a tough job. How does he go about it? Well, there are two ways to go about it. One is what we could call a family way. That is by writing only for instruments that belong to the same family. This would mean writing for an orchestra only of strings, or an orchestra only of woodwinds, or something like that. The other way is to mix up the instruments, putting members of different families together, and that would be more like the regular symphony orchestra you see here. The first way is more homey. It's like family relations getting together, and the other way is more like socializing, friends getting together from different families. Well, what do we mean when we say families? Well, I'm sure most of you must have heard that word over and over again, family, used whenever an orchestra is being described to you. You're always hearing about, for example, the woodwind family with Mama clarinet and grandfather bassoon. You know that one. And little sister piccolo, and big sister flute, and Uncle English horn, and Auntie oboe, and all the rest of this family. Well, in spite of all that baby talk, it's still true that these woodwinds are a sort of family. They're alike because they're all played by blowing wind into them, and they're all, well, almost all, made of wood. So they're called woodwinds. And they all sit near one another and behave as a family should behave. And they have all kinds of cousins, too. Different kinds of clarinets, for instance, like the little E-flat clarinet and the bass clarinet. And then there are saxophones and alto flutes and the oboe d'amore and contrabassoons. And, oh, it's a long list. Thank you. And there's even a group of sort of second cousins called the French horns. And they're second cousins because they're made of brass, and they really should belong to the brass family, but they blend so well with either the woodwinds or the brass that they're related to both families, so that they're kind of in-laws, I guess. Here's a French horn. Thank you. Now that we've met this big wind family, let's see how they can be used in orchestration. The minute one of them begins to play, even one of them playing all by himself, all alone, then we're already dealing with orchestration. Like that part in Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf, where the cat is being described. You remember that funny little melody in the clarinet? I'm sure you remember that tune. But that's already a piece of orchestration, we could say, because no other instrument in the whole woodwind section is so perfectly right for cat music. It's so velvety and dark and cat-like. So Prokofiev had to make a choice, and he chose the clarinet. And when he did that, he was orchestrating, and he was orchestrating well. But now things get more exciting as we begin to put together different members of the family in groups. Now here's part of a piece by the German composer Hindemith for 5 wind instruments, a great jolly piece. And listen to how fine these 5 relatives sound together: the flute, the oboe, the clarinet, the bassoon, and the French horn. Sounds like a family, doesn't it? They're all so alike, and they go with each other so naturally, and even though they all have different sounds or different colors, they're enough alike so that they blend. And now we go on to even a bigger family of winds. Here's a bit of a serenade by Mozart for 13 wind instruments, and listen to what a delicious sound they make. Marvelous, isn't it? And this family now is getting so big that it's beginning to sound more like what we think of as an orchestra, not just a little chamber group. But it's still a family orchestra. They're all woodwinds in it. Now, the great modern composer Stravinsky has written a symphony for an entire orchestra of winds only. And he really invented some brand new colors in this one. Just listen to these final bars of it. wonderful, cool colors. Well, now that's enough of the wind family for a while. Let's have a look now at this enormous family gathered around me here, the strings. And let's see how they can be used. We use 4 kinds of stringed instruments. The violins, of course, of which we have 34. Count them. And the violas, which look like violins, but which are a little bigger and sound a little lower. And the cellos, which are even bigger and lower. And then the double basses, which are the biggest and the lowest. Wave or something so we can see it. That's good. Thank you. Now again, it's the same story. Even if one lonely violin is playing, the composer has to orchestrate for him. Now this may sound silly to you, orchestrating for one lonely violin, but it is orchestrating in miniature, because even with one instrument, the composer has the problem of choosing. First he has to choose the violin itself instead of any other number of instruments, and then he has lots of other choices to make, like when the bow should move up and when it should move down, or whether the bow should jump. Would you show us what I mean by jump? Do that again, please. Fine. Or whether the bow should go smoothly, or maybe the bow shouldn't even be used at all. Then he has to decide whether to have more than one note sounding at a time, and lots of other choices like that. Now, these choices may sound to you like small potatoes, but they are all terribly important to orchestration. For instance, if a violinist plays America the Beautiful on the D string, it would sound like this. Good. But if he plays exactly the same notes, no higher and no lower, but on the G string, it would sound completely different, richer and fatter. Thanks. So you see, there's another important decision to be made. Now let's get some of these string cousins together in a group into a string quartet. 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. Now listen to how Beethoven actually orchestrates this quartet, making it so full of different colors by using devices like pizzicato, which means plucking the string with the finger, and ponticello, that's a hard word, which means bowing the string, but way up near what's called the bridge. Now listen to this. Now you see, it takes a master hand to orchestrate for 4 string instruments and get all those different sounds. The great composers were always looking for new and different sounds, and to get them they wrote for all kinds of different combinations of strings. And each combination has its own blend. For instance, listen to how gorgeously Schubert makes this melody sound in his quintet, which is the same combination as this quartet we just heard, but with one more cello added to make it richer. One of the most beautiful melodies ever written. And how it sounds on that cello. I think it's maybe my favorite melody in the world. Well, we've heard a quartet and a quintet, and there are also sextets, like one by Schoenberg, and there are octets by Mendelssohn and others, and so it grows until finally we get to the full string orchestra, all the strings you see here on the stage. And it's absolutely amazing the variety of sounds you can get from an orchestra that has only strings in it. Listen to this sound that the British composer Vaughan Williams gets by dividing the string orchestra into two half orchestras, and notice how the two groups sneak in and out of each other and change colors like a chameleon. Now, here's a completely different way of writing for a string orchestra, a more rugged, athletic way. This is from an American symphony by our old friend William Schumann. You remember him from our last program about American music? Well, here's that same old vitality we were talking about, that same American pep, only now it's for only a string orchestra. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, we have visited two families already, the winds and the strings. Now let's take a quick look at the other two families in our community here, the brass and the percussion. The brass family isn't very large compared with our string family, but boy, do they make themselves heard. The members of this family consist of the trumpets, the trombones, and the tuba. And, oh, of course, those 42nd cousins, or was it in-laws, or whatever we said, the French horns, which are both brass and wind. Thank you. Now, you'd be surprised how many different colors you can get from these brass blockbusters. They don't always have to be loud, for instance. Take this brass music by the old Italian composer Gabrieli. Listen to how beautiful it is. Pretty beautiful, isn't it? Of course, the brass can also make a more familiar sound. Thank you. We know that one. Now, just relax while we visit the percussion family next door, and this is really a big family. It would take a week to name all the percussion instruments, but that's only because almost anything can be a percussion instrument. A frying pan, or a baseball bat, or a steam whistle, or a cowbell, or anything that makes noise. Now, the head of this family is, of course, the timpani. And he is surrounded on all sides by all kinds of other drums and bells and clickers and tinklers and other noisemakers. But they're all a family, and there are pieces that are orchestrated and written just for them, like this canon, which was written by our very own timpanist, Mr. Goodman. Now, we have now been introduced to all the four families. And now we come to the more complicated business of orchestrating for what we call a symphony orchestra, this whole aggregation. And here's where the family spirit gives way to the big, friendly social spirit, and the members of the different families begin to mix together. Starting with the smallest combination, two people sort of shyly getting together to see how they'll get along, we can see the whole story in this simple little nutshell. Here is part of a Schubert sonata for a viola and piano, two instruments from very different families, but as you see, they get along very well indeed. You see, now we can begin to enjoy the blend of a mixture. It's in a way a new sound, because the pure family lines have been broken down and a new mixed sound has been born. Now let's enlarge this new social spirit to include 7 people. And listen to a little bit of Ravel's introduction in Allegro for a mixture of harp, flute, clarinet, and string quartet. That's a real mixed-up mixture. Now here's an even more mixed-up mixture by Stravinsky again. We're going to play you a march from his ballet, The Story of a Soldier. And again, you're going to hear 7 instruments: a solo violin, clarinet, a bassoon, a trumpet, a trombone, a double bass, and percussion, which is one man playing 13 different percussion instruments. Now, this is a really orchestral mixture because there is at least one member present of every family. There are 2 strings, there are 2 winds, there are 2 brass, and our drummer boy. It makes a marvelous sound altogether. That's fine. And so, little by little, we grow up to the regular big symphony orchestra we all know and love. 7 players become 17, and then 70, and finally 107. And you can imagine what a composer must go through to choose from all the possible combinations there are in this mix-up of families. But a good composer always knows deep down in his heart what the right choice must be, because if he's good, his music will make him choose right. The right music, played by the right instruments, in the right combinations, at the right time, that is good orchestration. Now, I've been racking my brain for days to try and decide what big piece to play for you to illustrate all these points, a piece that would really show you what good, right orchestration means. And while I was thinking, I realized that almost any fine piece of music would show this. Any symphony by Mozart or Brahms or Haydn or Tchaikovsky or Franck, Beethoven, Stravinsky. And I thought, well, what will you young people really learn from hearing one of those symphonies? You'd hear beautiful orchestration, all right, but you wouldn't know why it was beautiful unless I took hours and hours and maybe weeks to explain it in all its details. Then we'd have to learn to read music, and study every instrument, it would be like a whole course at a conservatory. So what I've decided to play for you is a piece that maybe isn't the greatest example of composing in the history of music, but is probably the most exciting orchestral exhibition in the history of music, the famous Bolero by Ravel. We're going to play the Bolero because it's such a marvelously clear example of how this big symphony orchestra can be used. And that's practically all it is. It's just one long tune repeated over and over, with the orchestration changing on each repeat, gradually getting bigger and louder and richer, adding to itself, growing and growing until it finally ends in the biggest orchestral scream you ever heard. But while it's going on, it gives you a chance to hear the orchestra in all its parts and all its special combinations, and that it does in a way that no other piece can. Now, the Bolero is built up in a very simple way, almost like something you can make with an erector set. First of all, there is a Bolero dance rhythm that goes on, never changing, in the snare drum. Now, over this rhythm that never stops, we hear a tune. A long, smooth, snaky melody, sort of Arabic, like very high-class hoochie-coochie music. This tune is in two parts, which we'll call part A and part B. This is part A you're hearing now on the flute. Then part A again, a little richer and fuller, by the clarinet. Now comes part B, way up high on the bassoon. Now part B gets repeated on the little E-flat clarinet. Now that makes one full section, and that's all the music there is in the whole piece. There's the oboe d'amore playing part A now. Remember him, that woodwind cousin we talked about? Now over and over again, we're going to hear part A twice, then part B twice, then part A twice again, and so on, always with different instruments, until the whole orchestra has been used up and shown off and tired out. But before it's over, you'll have heard all kinds of strange sounds and colors and combinations. And each time the orchestration changes, like now, trumpet and flute, it gets louder and richer and bigger, until by the end, everyone gets together for the big scream. In It makes a really very exciting trip through the world of orchestration. So bon voyage, and I hope you have a good time.